done downstairs. Is this an internet thing?
No, the internet is, I think it's just a
No,
computer.
it's, I'm saying you won't have speed
Oh, okay.
enough to do video probably,
Oh.
because it can't load it when there's
Well, it's
There.
low.
12 tax returns being done downstairs online, so
Okay, so,
you want this to be, there's full screen.
full screen.
Does the audio stand alone, Kevin?
Audio is easier for the internet to pull down, so video takes a
People
little.
like me who are watching the polls closely in the run-up to the election, you might have woken up that next day and thought, huh, I don't think they did a very good job on this one.
So this was obviously a tough year for pre-election polls. One thing that was really problematic this year is that there were a lot of forecasters out there projecting the probability that Hillary Clinton would win the election. And they were using a lot of polls, national polls and state level polls. And based on those polls, they were projecting very high probabilities that Clinton would win the election, and that's not what happened. Nationally, the polls weren't too bad. Most of them suggested that Clinton would win the popular vote, and indeed she did by a fairly narrow margin.
And at the same time, some of the key battleground states like Pennsylvania and Ohio went for Donald Trump in much greater margins than was originally predicted.
We have three hypotheses as to why this probably happened. The first is who was in the polls. So this is an idea called non-response bias, which basically says the people who take your survey are different than the people who won't take your survey. And we know from research that we've done in the past that people who have lower education, lower income, people who are less civically engaged, less likely to vote, less likely to contact an elected official, those people are all less likely to take your survey. So if those people aren't in your survey, and those people either vote or vote even more than one would expect, but have higher turnout than expected, that can be a problem for your polls.
Another possibility is what some people have been calling the shy Trumper hypothesis, which basically says that voting for Trump is considered socially undesirable by some people. They don't want to admit it either to an interviewer on the phone or to pollsters in general. And then when they get into the voting booth, who they actually vote for is not the same person that they told pollsters they were going to vote for.
There's a third possibility, and this one is a little polling geeky, sorry in advance. When you take a survey, because of social desirability bias, you end up getting more people telling you that they plan to vote than actually are going to turn out. So in a national election, you might get 50 or 55% of the public turning out, but you might get 70 or 80% of the people on the phone telling you they're going to vote because maybe that day they do plan to vote, and also voting is the right thing to do in a democracy, so they want to tell you that. So pollsters have to do something called modeling a likely electorate. They put what's called a likely voter screen on there, and they say, based on what I know about you, based on what you've told me, or answered in any fashion, I'm going to say, do you look like a likely voter? Do you look like someone who's voted in the past and follows politics and is enthusiastic? They'll tick through a number of things. And then they'll say, yes, okay, you, I'm putting in the sample to project the election, and you, I don't think you're really going to vote.
It was a real challenge this year for pollsters to measure the different levels of support groups who were going to turn out for each candidate. For Hillary Clinton, there was this question all year long about whether she could turn out some of those coalition groups that came out for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. And for Donald Trump, he drew support from some groups that were traditionally Democratic, particularly in some of those Midwest states that he was able to flip.
So to try to understand what's happened here, A4 has convened an ad hoc task force on the 2016 election polling. And what this is a group of experts from across the survey research industry who are going to look at polling accuracy in 2016, both in the primaries and in the general election, as well as historical polling accuracy in the primaries and in the general election.
And that's the good news. A bunch of really smart people will figure it out. The bad news is we won't be able to tell you what happened until May.
In the meantime, at the Pew Research Center, we are going to be reviewing our data, looking at both our telephone polls and the American Trends Panel, which gives us some unique opportunities to look at how individuals may have changed in what they were saying over time.
George Gallup had an interesting quote. He, of course, is the founder of the Gallup organization, where he said, if democracy is the will of the people, then maybe someone should go out and find out what that will is. And that is the essence of public opinion polling.
So hang in there, answer the phone when people call you. Pollsters need your help.
guess the Pew Research Center, which conducts a lot of its own polls and especially a lot of work on the news media, but also is heavily involved with AAPOR, or APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research. That report did come out in May of 2017 and essentially reinforced what they said in the video about the sources of error, a lot having to do with modeling the electorate and being sure that the people who were surveyed in advance of the election were those who were most likely to vote. And as she mentioned, there's that fall off because voting is civically acceptable and desirable behavior, and so people are inclined to say they will vote, even if they maybe aren't going to vote, or things happen on election day that prevent them from voting. I think that was actually the last slide. The other thing I was going to say about 2018 is that the pollsters did accurately predict the blue wave. That there was both the generic congressional ballot, where people indicated whether they were most likely to support a Republican or a Democratic candidate for Congress that year, and the individual congressional district polling correctly indicated that the House of Representatives would flip to the Democrats, and I think that the New York Times correctly predicted a swing of 40 seats to the Democrats, which turned out to be pretty close to the final. There's are two unfilled seats, both in North Carolina, and so I think if it's 40 seats gained for the Democrats now, and so depending on what happens there, it could be more than 40 that come over. I did promise a look at what might be the future of public opinion polling, and there is a public opinion expert, political scientist at Stanford University, James Fishkin, who heads something called the Center for Deliberative Democracy, and he has a new book called Democracy When the People Are Thinking, and he advocates for something called deliberative polling, and he describes it as a practical solution to many of democracy's ills. It can supplement existing institutions with practical reforms and can apply at all levels of government. Professor Fishkin is just an incredible scholar, teacher, and innovative public opinion expert.
Could you repeat that title again?
The book is called Democracy When the People Are Thinking. And I arranged for him to do a Skype guest lecture in my class last fall, and he was flattered that somebody in Idaho would be interested in deliberative polling. What it calls for is a random sample of voters who are then brought together for a day-long seminar at which they are giving non-biased briefing materials, either printed or by video, and then are given the opportunity to discuss issues, and then they do anonymous surveys at the beginning of the process, and then again after they've had the discussions. And it provides a lot of insights into why people hold certain beliefs, the sort of gradations of opinion that occur on complex public policy issues. It's really not a good snapshot tool for who are you going to vote for governor in the next election. But if you were trying to deal with some complicated policy issues like healthcare or energy policy or climate change, the opportunity to bring people together to be informed about an issue, to discuss it with their fellow citizens, produces some fascinating insights. And he's done this in both the U.S. And abroad. And I'd love to get him to come to Moscow the next time I teach this class. I will provide some links to some of my sources to information about Fishkin and his book and the Pew Center. And Mary, if I send that to you, you can circulate it to the membership. To Joan. Okay, so good. So, well, thank you for your attention. I'm sorry about the technology, but I think you got enough of it to get a flavor, and I am glad to answer your questions. So Karen, you had your hand up first.
You didn't say anything about Russian interference, and I was wondering, when the polls are taken, if people are asked where do they get their news, because some of the news that was coming out during, not the last 18 election, but in the 16 election, were so deflammatory to Hillary, and like the pizza and the kids being molested in the basement of the pizza joint. That had to have an influence.
The Pew Center does an annual survey on media consumption. Where do people get their international, national, state, local news? Breaks it down by all different forms of media as well as specific media outlets. There's undoubtedly some scholars have tried to do a correlation between presidential preferences and the source of news, and it should be no surprise that people tend to self-select. And one finding from 2018 was that the siloing of news, that Democrats tend to go to ESPN up to MSNBC and CNN, and Republicans tend to go to Fox News. But as to the degree to which social media influence the outcome of the election, I think the scholars are still trying to sort that out. Go ahead.
I'm really interested in the wording of polls. I wonder if you could give us some sort of question of wording.
So we spend a whole week on question wording in my public speaking class, because I have the students conduct their own surveys on campus. And we talk about how the order of questions and the information that precedes a question in terms of background influence answers. We look at national polls taken about the same time, dealing with the same subject. And I'm trying to think if there was an example. A lot of questions about healthcare polling.